$400. That was the monthly rent on a one-bedroom unit above a laundromat in Muskegon, Michigan. For a woman named Carla, working 31 hours a week at a dollar store, $400 was not a bill. It was a wall she could not climb. In March of 2019, Carla and her 4-year-old son Miles were living out of a 1998 Buick LeSabre parked behind a closed tire shop. The back seat folded halfway. Miles slept curled against the door, a winter coat rolled under his head. She had $200 left after the eviction, a car with a quarter tank of gas, and a decision to make. Most people in her position wait, save a little, hope for a shelter bed. Carla did something different. She decided to build a house with what she had, starting that week. What she built over the next 9 weeks became a permanent home. She has not paid rent since. And the way she made that permanent is the part almost nobody expects. Every dollar, every material source, every workaround. Here is exactly how she did it. Carla's story is not a tragedy with a house attached to it. It is a set of decisions, each one solving a specific problem, that together add up to something most housed Americans could not build with 10 times her budget. If you've ever wondered how someone actually escapes the rent trap for good, not temporarily, not with a program that runs out, but permanently, this is that mechanism laid out step by step. The money isn't the interesting part. The math is. $200 does not buy lumber. It does not buy a permit. It does not buy land. So the real question isn't how Carla built a structure. It's how she solved 4 separate impossible problems: materials, legality, land, and permanence, using almost no money at all, and why the order she solved them in mattered more than any single material she used. The first problem was lumber. A basic prefab shed kit at a Michigan home improvement store runs $1,200 or more. Carla had $200 total for everything. She learned about construction site salvage from a man named Ray, a retired framer she met in line at a food pantry on Apple Avenue. Ray told her which new-build subdivisions outside Muskegon were actively framing houses and which days the dumpsters got hauled away. Framing crews toss cutoffs, warped boards, and damaged plywood into dumpsters that sit for 2 to 3 days before pickup. A single dumpster from a subdivision build can hold 20 or more usable 2x4s and sheets of plywood with only cosmetic damage. Carla drove out after crews left for the day, 3 evenings a week for 2.5 weeks, filling the trunk of the Buick with lumber that would have gone to a landfill by Friday. Total fuel cost for those trips, about $30. Her second source was the Habitat for Humanity Restore on Getty Street. Donated materials sell there at a fraction of retail. She found a stack of reclaimed metal roofing pulled from a barn teardown in Newaygo County, enough to cover her roof, for $35. Her third and biggest source was pallets. Feed stores and small manufacturers around Muskegon give away used shipping pallets to anyone willing to haul them. A single pallet, broken down carefully, yields 6 to 8 solid boards plus cross-bracing. Carla collected over 30 pallets in 10 days, strapping 4 or 5 at a time to the Buick's roof rack, borrowed from Ray. She ruined the first several pallets trying to pry them apart with a claw hammer. A woman at the same food pantry showed her the real technique. Score along the nail line with a utility knife. Angle a flat pry bar in low. Work it slow. The board comes off clean instead of splitting. By her second week, Carla could strip a pallet in under 20 minutes. Materials total at this point: $35 for roofing, $30 for fuel, $20 for screws and hardware from the restore, $10 for caulk and spray foam. That left her about $105 from the original $200. Pallet wood specifically is stronger than most people assume. Standard shipments pallets are built from hardwoods like oak or pine, rated to carry thousands of pounds of stacked cargo, which means a disassembled board, once cleaned of nails, often outperforms cheap construction-grade lumber sold new at big box stores. The trade-off is labor, not strength. Every board has to be pulled, de-nailed, and checked for splits by hand, which is exactly why most builders skip it. Carla didn't have the option to skip it. Now she needed somewhere to legally put it. This is the part that surprises people. Carla did not hide a structure in the woods. She asked. Rural Michigan, like rural Georgia or rural Illinois, has thousands of acres of underused private land. Fields nobody farms anymore. Wooded lots behind houses owned by elderly residents who can't maintain them. Carla approached a widower named Harlan who owned 4 acres along a county road outside Muskegon, mostly overgrown, with a fence line he could no longer keep up. She offered a direct trade, a place for a small structure on the back corner of his land, in exchange for mowing, brush clearing, and checking on his house whenever he traveled. He said yes. No lease, no paperwork. A verbal agreement between 2 people who understood exactly what the other needed. This is more common in rural communities than most people realize, and it is not the fragile arrangement it sounds like. Michigan townships generally don't require building permits for structures under 200 square feet that aren't connected to municipal water or sewer. Carla built her footprint at 96 square feet. That number was not a guess. She called the township zoning office from the library and asked directly before she cut a single board. That single phone call is the most overlooked step in stories like this. It's the difference between a structure that can stay indefinitely and one a code officer can order removed in 30 days. Most people building out of desperation skip this step entirely, assuming that asking questions invites trouble. Carla's experience says the opposite. Zoning offices in small townships often care less about enforcement than about liability, and a friendly, upfront call establishing that a structure is small, unconnected to utilities, and on private land with owner permission tends to end the conversation quickly, in the builder's favor. This threshold isn't unique to Michigan. Most states use a similar square footage cutoff, usually somewhere between 100 and 200 square feet, below which a structure is legally treated the same as a garden shed instead of a dwelling. It's a detail almost never advertised anywhere, buried in zoning code language most people never think to look up, which is exactly why so few people ever use it. The foundation went down first. 12 cinder blocks pulled from a collapsed outbuilding on Harlan's property, arranged in a pier pattern, 3 rows of 4, leveled with a 4-foot level and packed sand. Lifting the floor 8 inches off the ground kept moisture from wicking up into the wood and meant no poured slab, which would have both cost money and triggered a permit. She learned the framing sequence from the same 3 YouTube videos, watched on her phone at the Muskegon Public Library, replayed so many times she could recite the steps before she cut the wood. Studs went up at 24-inch spacing instead of the standard 16, which uses less material and still holds for a small single-story build. Pallet boards, thinner than dimensional lumber, but strong once fastened right, filled in as exterior sheathing over the salvaged 2x4s. The roof mattered most. A single slope shed roof, higher at the front, angled down toward the back, so rain runs away from the door and toward where she'd eventually collect it. The reclaimed metal panels went down over the frame with a 2-inch overhang on every side, every seam sealed with silicone caulk, the only material she bought at full retail price. Under the pallet wood sheathing, she wrapped the whole exterior in Tyvek house wrap, pulled in wide, usable offcuts from the same construction dumpsters. Builders trim it generously and toss the rest. She stapled it up, overlapped every seam by 6 inches, taped every joint. This layer is what actually separates a shed from a shelter. Without a proper moisture barrier, wind-driven rain finds every seam in a wall, no matter how well the boards fit. And once water gets behind the sheathing, wood rot follows within a single season. The first hard rain came 4 days after she finished. She stood inside and listened to it hit the metal roof. Not one drop came through the walls. For the first time in 7 months, she and Miles were dry in a storm without being inside a car. The systems worked in April rain. They were tested for real in November. An early cold front dropped temperatures into the teens 2 months sooner than the region usually sees them, and Carla hadn't finished insulating the back wall. She had cardboard and old blankets pinned between the studs on 3 sides, but the 4th wall was still bare sheathing when the front hit overnight. Miles woke up crying, not from a nightmare, from cold air moving across the floor where the wall met the foundation. Carla checked the thermometer she kept on a shelf. 38 degrees inside, colder than a refrigerator. She didn't have money for more insulation that week. What she had was every piece of fabric in the structure. She stripped the extra blankets off her own bed, packed them into the open wall cavity, and duct taped a painter's tarp over the whole thing as a temporary vapor block until she could get back to the restore. Then she pulled a battery lantern close, wrapped Miles in both sleeping bags, and sat against the finished wall with him until the sun came up and the temperature climbed back into the 40s. 3 days later, she had $15 saved from a shift bonus. She used it on a bag of loose-fill insulation from the Restore's damaged bag bin, discounted because the bag had torn, not because the material was bad. That afternoon, she finished the 4th wall for good. It never happened again. She said later that the worst part wasn't the cold. It was realizing how close, almost finished, had come to being dangerous, and how a $15 bag of insulation was the entire distance between the two. The interior systems that came after that night are where the real planning shows. A 55-gallon food-grade drum free from a bakery supply company that was discarding barrels that had held cooking oil sits under the low end of the roofline. A short gutter section feeds rainwater into it through a mesh screen that catches debris. West Michigan gets over 34 inches of rain a year, more than enough for washing, cooking, and cleaning when supplemented by the library's water fountain during her weekly visits. She treats it with a few drops of unscented bleach per gallon, letting it sit 30 minutes before use. A method used in off-grid communities for decades. Annual cost of purification about $4 in bleach. A single 55-gallon drum refilled naturally through West Michigan's regular rainfall can supply 2 people's washing and cooking needs for roughly a week between refills, which is why rainwater catchment shows up again and again in low-budget builds across completely different climates and states. Cooking runs on a 2-burner propane camp stove bought on clearance for $22. Lighting comes from battery lanterns and a solar charger from a dollar store, propped on the roof by day, powering a small light strip at night. Miles does his coloring by that light now instead of a car dome light. Heat, after the November scare, comes from a small ceramic space heater run off an extension cord from an outlet on Harlan's garage, offered freely, plus the insulation finished properly on all four walls this time, with the same air gap principle serious builders use, a small vented gap between the insulation and the metal skin so moisture never gets trapped and rots the wall from inside out. This detail matters more than it sounds. Sealed insulation against bare metal traps the moisture that two people breathing overnight naturally produce, and that trapped moisture condenses, soaks the insulation, and grows mold within weeks. A half-inch gap with airflow at top and bottom carries that moisture out before it ever touches the cold metal, keeping the insulation dry, and dry insulation is the only kind that actually holds heat. The build's total cost when Carla finished came to $191. $9 left from the original $200, but the number that matters more is what came after. Harlan, watching how carefully Carla maintained the land, eventually offered her something most people in her position never get near: the chance to buy the back acre outright over time at a price scaled to what she could actually pay. $25 a month, no bank, no interest, a private land contract between two people who trusted each other. 18 months in, she is 2/3 of the way to owning that ground outright. That detail is the difference between a temporary fix and Carla never paying rent again. It's not the structure that makes this permanent. It's the ground underneath it, and the fact that once she owns that acre, there is no landlord left to answer to, ever. If you're in a car right now or close to it, here's what actually mattered in this story, because it wasn't luck. It was order of operations. Materials before land, legality before construction, a phone call to a zoning office before a single board got cut, and most of all, treating almost finished as a real danger, not a milestone to feel good about. Carla solved 4 impossible problems with $200. What to build with, where to put it, how to keep it legal, and how to make it last. Every one of those problems had a free or nearly free answer once she knew where to look. A food pantry contact, a library computer, a restore discount bin, a neighbor with more land than he could use. Miles is 7 now. He has his own corner of the back room, a shelf Carla built from pallet wood, holding his books, and a jar of rocks he collects from Harlan's field. The house Carla built for $191 has outlasted apartments that cost 10 times as much a month, survived 4 Michigan winters, and sits on ground she is quietly, slowly coming to own. She said the hardest lesson wasn't the cold or the labor or the 2 a.m. panic in November. It was learning that permanent doesn't come from the walls. It comes from who owns the dirt beneath them. Somewhere tonight, someone is doing exactly what Carla was doing in that Buick, running the same impossible math, wondering if $200 and a piece of borrowed land could ever actually be enough. It was enough for Carla. It has been enough for 4 winters and counting. If this story stayed with you, say so below. Tell us where you're watching from, and tell us what part of Carla's story you'd have given up on first, because most people would have.